Howdy! Today we continue on with our Bible study, looking at this book called Confronting Christianity, written by Rebecca McLaughlin. And it's an attempt to answer some of the major questions that concern Christianity right now in our postmodern world. I guess one could say that a lot of this started with Bertrand Russell in 1930s. He wrote, "Religion prevents us from removing the fundamental causes of war. Religion prevents us from teaching the ethic of scientific cooperation in place of the fierce old doctrines of sin and punishment. It is possible that mankind is on the threshold of a golden age. But if so, it will be first be necessary to slay the old dragon that guards the door, and this dragon is religion." So I can't think of a quote that more exemplifies the thinking that happened starting in the 30s and 40s and gained a lot of traction and continues to do so today. This notion that most wars are caused by religion, so if we get rid of religion, we get rid of wars. As a matter of fact, you would be surprised how much of that is now taught in history classes in high school and in college classes throughout the United States. It's all part of a trend by the secular humanist to get rid of religion. The joke is that secular humanism is a religion in and of itself. And we'll talk a little bit as we get further along as to why I say these things. So, first thing we're going to look at, has religion been used to justify violent acts? Yeah, that's true. The one that Christians most often have thrown in their face is the Crusades. And there were 4 major Crusades. But it's important to understand kind of what was happening on that, in those Crusades and the time frame. You see, the Christians and Jews had lived in Jerusalem for hundreds of years. And in the 500s, Islam took over, the Muslims took it over, and pretty much allowed them to continue to live peacefully. They just had to pay tribute, which, by the way, is required under Islam, because Islam is both a religion and a government. So if you are living under Islamic rule, you have a choice: convert or pay taxes. And so they paid taxes. Now, this is kind of, if Christianity really caused the Crusades, then it would be a violation of the teaching of Jesus. Jesus taught to turn the other cheek. By the way, a misunderstood example. See, in the Hebrew world, when you wanted to humiliate someone, you could hit them with the back of your right hand, and you had to hit their right cheek. So it was like this, okay? So if I turn and give you only my left cheek, my right cheek is back behind me, and you can't hit it with your right hand. So it's not a matter of Christians capitulating to abuse. It is rather a passive resistance. I won't strike you back, but I will not give you the opportunity to do so without humiliating yourself. If you hit my left cheek, well, then you are the one who is now going to be the pariah in the village. Now, the disciples resisted Jesus' arrest. You remember that, where Peter pulls his sword out. He's going to defend Jesus. And Jesus not only rebukes him, but he heals the guard's ear. So one could argue that really didn't have anything to do with the idea of resistance, but that in fact Jesus wasn't going to allow anything to keep him from his course headed to the cross for the redemption of mankind. But I would argue that Jesus only that did resist, but he resisted in a different way. He resisted because, remember, when they come up, they say, "Who are you looking for, Jesus of Nazareth? I am he." And they all fall down. And then they ask again, and he answers again, and they all fall down. So Jesus did show them that he had the power to do whatever he needed to do. But he went along with this because this was part of his plan. Jesus was in control all the time. But he did teach us to love our enemies and pray for them. And you kind of wonder where that came from. Well, when the 12 tribes, Jacob, Israel, and the 12 tribes were brought to the promised land, to Egypt, because there was a drought and famines and so forth, and Joseph brought his brothers and his father there to provide for them. They were living in a culture that was very foreign to God and very against the kinds of things of God. And I'll give you an example. Here's an example of Egyptian justice. So you're working on this building and you're putting in bricks, and you accidentally drop one and it kills the guy below you. Well, his family would come, they would kill you, they would kill your family, they would probably kill some of your extended family, and they may even kill your neighbors. So it was very disproportional justice. So while God was bringing them out of Egypt into the promised land, he had to teach them a different way. And so the law was basically prescribed to them an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. In other words, proportional justice. You cannot, by the way, that's what our whole judicial system is based on, or at least had been until recently, which is that you receive back what you give in kind, not more and not less. When Jesus comes, he says, "You have heard it said, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. But I say to you, love your enemies and pray for them." And then he gave some wonderful examples. For instance, he talks about, if someone asks you to carry their stuff for a mile, carry it for 2 miles. Well, that's a reference to the Roman law. A Roman soldier could compel you to carry his gear for a mile. Jesus says, go a second mile to show him that you didn't do it because you were being compelled, but you did it because you love your neighbor. So those are the kinds of ways that Jesus talked about. Even on the cross, as he is suffering the sin of the entire world, he offers forgiveness to all of those who have crucified him, as well as the thief on the cross. Now, that's not how you and I would look at things, but then we're not Jesus. We are called to follow him, but we are imperfect in that act. Even in 9/11, we had the Bush saying that it was a crusade, this war on terrorism, and bin Laden said it was an Islamic battle against a new crusade. And so, although both sides used words that would indicate that this was religious, it was only bin Laden that was really true, because his understanding of Islam was, Islam means peace, the kind of peace that comes from you either converting or dying. That is exactly what it is, because Islam believes that everyone should be under Islamic rule, and they view it to be a rebuke against them that they have not conquered and rule everything, because Allah must be blessing the West, and that causes them to be very upset. So that kind of talks a little bit about how the Crusades are. We'll talk a little bit later further about it. So the Crusades were actually about profit adventure, using religion for support. In, I think it was 1046, we had the Turkish Muslims come in and conquer Jerusalem, only they didn't want to let them live in peace. Instead, they slaughtered everyone. It was a quite disconcerting thing. It was one thing to allow the holy city to be kept so that Christians could visit, and it was another thing to wipe them out, and men, women, and children. So the Crusades were then mounted, as Wilkins says, a Christian counteroffensive against the occupation of lands that had been Christian for centuries before the arrival of Islam. Now, I will tell you that I don't think that that was exactly what happened. I have read extensively on each of the four Crusades, and I can tell you that in reality, these were merchants. These were people who wanted to establish a very profitable adventure. So they built fortresses immediately, and then started trade, sending stuff back to Europe and England in order to make money. And each of the continuing crusades were less and less covered under this thin veneer of this being a holy war of Christians against Muslims. Now, on the other hand, if you study a little bit about the beginning of Islam, Muhammad was a very young man, and he married an older woman who was quite wealthy. And in his early life, he was quite the nanny. He looked around, and everywhere he saw was a very hedonistic society. Everyone there was all kinds of drinking and carousing and all of that kind of stuff, and he wanted to have something that was that would enforce some kind of control, some way of putting back in some kind of morality. So he went to what was there, this big structure, and that you will see the Muslims go to every year, and they travel there, and they will go around that in Mecca, and they will throw stones at it, essentially throwing stones at Satan. Now he went inside there, and inside there is all these names of all these different gods. And Muhammad picked one and said, "That's him, that's God." Okay? Now, having finally decided on what he wanted to use as a tool for this, he then started gathering people around him. The parallel between Muhammad and Hitler are quite extensive. He essentially gathered a group of brown shirts. Now, he tried to preach this new religion in Mecca, but they rejected him. Well, not being one who was willing to give up, he then took this small army, and they went to Medina, a nearby town, and they invaded them. From that base, he then established a larger army, came back, and conquered Mecca. And from there, we have the beginnings of Islam. Now, by the way, his wife writes that he put in this notion of having more than one wife, and gave himself permission to marry, to sleep with children, because that's what he wanted to do, was to sleep with kids. A charge that was also made by Joseph Smith's wife in the Mormon religion. So he was quite a warlike guy, and Islam was quite a warlike religion. Now, after his death, we have written many years later the Quran. And the Quran was written by, they say, looking at his notes and stories and everything else that had come down. Uh, you see, Muhammad realized that the Jews and the Christians were people of the book. They had a book about their God. They had something to follow. And he always wanted to have a religion and a book about that was to his people, to the Arabs. And so after his death, the Muslims took what is commonly referred to as Palestine. It was really the greater empire of Solomon, Judea and Samaria. And then he took Syria, Egypt, most of North Africa. From there they spread up through Asia Minor, through what is today Turkey, and eventually across southern Europe to where they took most of Spain over, and were at the across from the Danube from Vienna. And there's a wonderful. This is a wonderful history that you probably at some point should take the time to learn. But in Islam, once you have conquered a land, that land becomes forever yours. So you will see a lot of the rhetoric that when they talk about jihads and so forth, you'll see a lot of information there about the reclaiming of Spain and the reclaiming of these properties. This, by the way, is the cause for the conflict in what was formerly Yugoslavia. When the Muslims conquer a nation, you're given that same thing that happened when the Turks took over Jerusalem. You have a choice: convert, or pay a rather stiff tax every year. Okay, and because of this, we see that Bosnia-Herzegovina conflict that happened over there, and it was in the minds of the people who were there. They were just finishing or continuing a war that was started by the Muslims. And in the Western Europe and the United States, we didn't look at that history. We just assumed that this was an ethnic cleansing that was unwarranted, and didn't realize the anger that was still there. And that kind of anger can last for centuries, as we know when we talk about the conflict that has occurred between the children of Abraham. So anyway, all of those countries had been Christian, and so you can see where there has been conflict between Islam and Christianity for a long time. Now. And getting back to Jerusalem, this tit for tat continues today. Jerusalem was conquered in 637, but they continued to allow Christian pilgrims come for a fee. And so it was really kind of a profit-making adventure. When a Muslim tells you that Muhammad ascended to heaven there on the rock on top of that mount, it is made up. It is trying to provide a cover for why they, took the Temple Mount and converted it into a mosque. Okay. Then we see the Muslim Turks coming in 1076, and they killed all the pilgrims, desecrated the holy sites. And from that, there was an appeal then by the people to Western Christianity. Please come and save us. So Pope Urban II had a conference in 1095, and out of that conference came the First Crusade. Now, as I said before, it was clothed in religious garments in order to stir people up. In our lives, religion is probably the second most thing that stirs our emotions up, next to our close family, right? So from that came the First Crusade to Jerusalem. By the way, most of the people who started out on that crusade did not make it to Jerusalem. What was left was a remnant, but it was enough to conquer Jerusalem and refortify it and so forth. Now, here's part of the shameful part. You see, those Christians, at least in name, did exactly to the Muslims what had been done to Jerusalem in 1076 by the Turks. They slaughtered all of the Muslim men, women, and children. Then in the Fourth Crusade, Constantinople responded to a Latin massacre by taking over Constantinople, which had been conquered and everyone had been destroyed there, and so that was the Fourth Crusade. Now, you also have other conflicts in Christianity. You have the Catholics, the Protestants in Northern Ireland, and Catholics. There again, we see that the reasons are far more complicated than simply Catholic-Protestant. Without being stirred up, Catholics and Protestants have lived side by side in the British Isles with conflicts, yes, but in between with lots of peace. Okay? And in reality, Southern Ireland, which is Catholic, wants to take over Northern Ireland, but the people in Northern Ireland have consistently, which is dominantly Protestant, have consistently voted to be part of England and to be Protestant. So self-determination is apparently not important to the Catholics. It's important that they have a united Ireland under Catholicism. There's another one that kind of stands out in this conflicts between Christians and amongst themselves. We have over in Africa the Hutu slaughter of the Tutsis. Now, you've probably heard something about that. It was in the news for quite a while. That, by the way, that conflict continues yet today. Now, here's the odd thing. You see, the Belgians, when they established a nation over there in this part of Africa, the Belgians were very keen on being orderly and being able to classify things. And so they classified this one tribe as Hutu and this other tribe as Tutsi. However, the entire nation, Hutus and Tutsis, are Christian. And so you have this conflict that goes on. Now, here's the odd part. They've gone over and studied these, and the Hutu and the Tutsis are genetically indistinguishable. There was, other than tribalism, there is nothing that is different. They speak the same language, Bantu and French. They basically worship the same God. Everything is the same. But what happens is a little difference causes a huge amount of pain. So we've talked about how there were conflicts in Christian past, and perhaps some of that has something to do with religion. We'll talk about the numbers later. But let's turn to another religion, because this isn't just about Christianity. It's also about other religions. Well, I don't know about you, but for most of my life, I heard about Buddhism as being this religion of peace. You have a mantra, you meditate, you don't kill anything that's alive. The whole idea is to gradually go up as you continue to be reincarnated, and eventually, for them, nirvana is nothingness. You become one with the universe. Okay? Well, that would be news to people who the Muslims who live in Myanmar. The Rohingya Muslims were slaughtered, an outright genocide by Muslims there. By the way, the same thing continues in India, where the Muslims are also slaughtered by the Buddhists and by the Hindus. Okay, so what they did to those Rohingya Muslims makes the atrocities that ISIS did look tame. These are things that happen there that I can't even point you to something to read because it is that shocking. They killed the men and the boys. They threw children, babies into the fire. They lined the women up and brought them in groups of 5 into huts. They raped them. Then they fastened the door shut and burned down the hut and killed the women. And that is a small part of the atrocities that occurred. We also have the Sri Lanka Civil War from 1983 to 2009, which was also, again, Buddhists and slaughtering. And then we have the World War II, and you say, well, how does World War II fit into this? Well, Japan is largely a Shinto Buddhist nation, and they're very nationalistic. So that was the guiding philosophy behind all of that. By the way, they're also very xenophobic. Japan has maintained a long, long history of what I call racial purity. If you are not pure Japanese, you're looked down on. The Japanese think that the Asians are the master race. They are the pinnacle of that. They look down upon the Chinese as being uncivilized and the Koreans as being just animals, okay? And so this fight was a lot more than just the desire to have, desire to look for somebody to conquer and resources and things like that. It was also fueled by a Shinto Buddhist nationalism. Now there's a movie that was made called Silence, and it talks about the slaughter in the 17th century of Christians in Japan, both Japanese and foreign Christians. And what happened there was far worse than the Crusades that happened 500 years earlier. Now, you're taught about the Crusades in history, and you hear about it all the time in the news. You never, ever, ever hear about the slaughter of by the Japanese of the Christians in the 17th century, which was far worse than what happened to the Crusades. Okay, so we tend to pick and choose the things that we want to teach people, and we often miss them. By the way, genocide in Africa has been going on for thousands of years between the different tribes. Here in America, the Indians, the so-called Native Americans, have also had the same kinds of genocides. Wherever you have people in different groups, you have histories of atrocities and war. So, what about communism? I mean, isn't that the panacea? Isn't that an answer out of our dilemma? After all, if religion is so bad, why don't we go to communism? And I'll give you my version of one joke, and that is socialism has at its core a very Christian set of values. Each according to his needs, and each producing according to their abilities. And so that actually was adopted by the early church. We see that in Acts 32 to 35. They shared, they often sold their property, they cared for each other, they fed the poor. It was kind of like a commune, okay? But you have to ask yourself a question. It didn't last very long in the early church. Okay? And by the way, all attempts at creating communes that will continue have never worked in the history of the world. And you ask yourself why? I mean, doesn't Christianity talk about this kind of love, this brotherly love? Yeah, it is. But we also have our old Adam. And it fell apart very quickly because people, when they found out they didn't have to work and still got fed and taken care of, well, they quit working. And so that the notion of that sounds Christian, but in reality it ends up in everybody is equally poor and starving. Well, then what about capitalism? Well, capitalism has at its roots a very anti-Christian idea, this idea of selfishness. I am out for my own self-interest. I will take care of myself. I put my needs ahead of others. Very unchristian in its philosophy. But harnessing that old Adam, that self-love, that desire for more, that bottomless pit that will never be filled, we have created immense amounts of wealth with capitalism and have had the resources to care for the poor, establish welfare systems, build houses, etc., and take care of those who cannot provide for themselves, the sick, the lame, those who are born with mental challenges, things like that. Now, most hospitals and all of those kinds of things really came about because of the Christian religion. In Rome, in the early days of the church, the followers of Christianity were largely among many of the wives of the wealthy there in Rome and among their slaves. Well, there came a plague to Rome, and most of the wealthy people moved out to their summer homes away from Rome. And as you know, the plague is spread by fleas on rats. And so the rats obviously couldn't follow them, and so the disease didn't follow them. Now, a lot of their servants who were Christians said, "We're staying. We're not going to go out with you because people are in need here. And if I die, well, Jesus died for me. I will die for my neighbor." And so they stayed and took care of the people and nursed them. When the wealthy came back, they asked them, "Why did you do this?" And they said, "Well, I could do no less than what Christ did for me." Now, here's the thing. When you are treating the bubonic plague, just being cared for, being nursed, fed, given water, etc., gives you a 50% greater chance of living. So that early church showed that kind of selflessness. People in those days didn't have to ask who the Christians were. They were countercultural. They cared about their neighbor. They tried not to lie. They didn't try to steal. They would go out of their way to share. The Christian church was known by its acts and who they were. Now, along comes Karl Marx, and he takes a look at it, and he said, well, religion doesn't help the poor. It simply provides them with a false hope. He called it opium, the opium of the poor. They would never, ever get rid of this until they threw off the shackles of religion. So one of the basic tenets of communism is that enforced socialism and atheism. And that was the whole purpose of that. If you removed religion, you would be on the road to justice, and atheism was the answer to that. Well, let's talk about how that worked out. Well, in the Soviet Union, which is probably our largest example of a nation that tried to follow communism more purely than we've seen before. Well, they had collective farms, huge farms, and yet they were unable to feed their own people. They harnessed all of the manufacturing, and it was all driven from top down. Often you'll hear this from people. Well, if we get the really smart elite people to run things, well, everything will be better. We won't have so much waste. Capitalism wastes a lot of things. Well, you're right. But socialism and communism actually cause worse problems. You see, even though they had these big collective farms, the people weren't really buying that if I work really hard, everybody's going to get fed, and therefore I'll get mine too. And so they didn't work very hard. Well, the Soviet Union, realizing on the face of starvation, and which would have probably caused a rebellion and the end of that nation, they decided they would go ahead and start letting these workers have small plots to till for themselves, for their own families. Well, that provided a really bad example. Those small plots pretty soon fed the entire nation. Okay, so self-interest is not a wonderful thing, but harnessed properly, it provided for everyone. Okay. Now, Marxism also kills. All we've got to do is look at the Soviet Union, China, North Korea, Cambodia, Vietnam, etc., etc., etc. Even South Africa was formed under a Marxist religion, and that resulted in some tremendous problems. And it was the wealthiest nation in Africa and among the wealthier in the country, and it is now among the poorest. And they're trying very hard now, after they confiscated all of the farms from the white farmers and gave them to the black workers. They have been basically a basket case economically. And so now they're trying to figure out how they get back, and they're going half a step. They're not giving back the farms to the previous owners. What they are doing is trying to pay them recompense for that. So they're going to pay for what they previously stole. The problem is I don't see how that's going to create an economic base for them to continue. It is obvious that the former farmers and so forth don't have the skills to run that, and it is also obvious that that giving somebody money is not going to create an economy. You can't spend your way to prosperity, even though we try that here in the United States. You can't give people things for free and expect to create prosperity. We have put trillions of dollars since Johnson's war on poverty to try to eliminate poverty. The problem is it's become a big business, and so every year we move the bar. What does poor look like? Because if you look at the so-called poor in 2018, before the pandemic, the poor lived at a higher standard of living than did the middle class when Johnson started the war on poverty. So it's been conquered a long time ago. When people call people poor, they don't include in that assessment of their income all of the things they get for free: housing, food, medical care, etc., etc. Or you would understand that right now our poor actually have more resources than the lower middle class. So communism wants universal justice. But unfortunately, it doesn't work. And so they follow down this pathway. First comes socialism, and socialism starts trying to even the plane. So everybody's going to be equal. Unfortunately, the stated goal of socialism is everybody's equally poor. And that doesn't work so well. So the next thing you do is you say, well, if I only had more force. When Obama did Obamacare, I remember him distinctly coming out and saying time after time after time, people will support this if they just understand what it is. I'll do more speeches, and then when they finally get that it works, then everybody will support it. And he blamed the failure of Obamacare on the fact that it wasn't supported by Republicans and conservatives, rather than realizing that it failed under its own the weight of its own ineptness. Did you know that more money was spent on just creating the website for Obamacare than would be spent if we were to build a wall around the entire United States? It's amazing. Okay, so when that doesn't work, then the next thing comes force. So when they did Obamacare, they realized they had to have the young people overpay for their insurance in order to cover the people who had pre-existing conditions and the unhealthy. So they put in what was a small tax that would eventually grow to be a very large tax, which essentially would force the young to go and take out insurance they didn't need, because mostly the young are fairly healthy. And so really all they need is disaster health insurance, nothing, nothing, not the daily stuff, okay? And that was basically the plan. Every place we've seen socialism, it becomes more and more enforced. When people point to universal health care over in England, I point to the fact that, yes, healthcare is nothing's more expensive than something that's free. So having free healthcare, really free healthcare, is impossible. It has to be restrained because our desires need to be restrained. And otherwise, we just so overclog the system that everybody would need to be a doctor in order to have that demand filled by supply. So you either have to limit it by cost, okay, or you have to limit it by limiting access, or you limit it by what is covered, okay, or some combination of those three. So under universal health care, you will often see these kinds of things. In England today, if you need to have dialysis, which is very expensive, if you get to be over the age of 60, they won't do it because you're not deemed to have enough benefit for that cost, okay? In Canada, you need to schedule elective surgery sometimes months or years in advance, and oftentimes you will see them come down here to the United States where they can just get it. Yes, they have to pay for it, but at least they get what they need. So communism, socialism doesn't really work, and it ultimately ends up in force, which ends up in a lot of death. So let's talk about the Hitler issue. Many have tried to tie Hitler to religion and say that this was a failure of Christianity. Well, let's talk about it. When Hitler first got started, he realized that there was a lot of power in religion, and Germany was highly religious. Northern Germany and southern Germany, Catholics and Lutherans, and so he wanted to repurpose religion for power. So he took the Old Testament out completely. He rewrote the New Testament, and he took over churches under the guise of having positive Christianity. So the New Testament was written to Jesus was an Aryan, that's the master race. This was all done because of evolution. The Aryan race is the master race. All other races are inferior. Jews are just dogs, not really human, and we will blame everything on them. The Sermon on the Mount was written from what was essentially a recapitulation of the Ten Commandments to be very militaristic. Now, as this first came along, remember they were coming out of a great economic collapse that happened from World War I, and then a very weak government in between that. Inflation was rampant, people were starving and so forth. And so when Hitler came along, he promised plenty. The Volkswagen, the people's car, everybody gets a car. Everybody's going to be fed. Everybody's going to be taken care of. And initially, a lot of Christians collaborated with this because they thought it was going to be a good thing for the people. However, the Lutheran pastors soon recognized that this was not a good thing, and many of the Lutheran pastors, including the most famous Bonhoeffer, were imprisoned along with the Jews because they rebelled against this distortion of Christianity. So it would kind of be hard to talk about Hitler as being a Christian genocide. So what about democracy? Isn't democracy the answer? Well, no, it's not. Pure democracy is probably the most oppressive and tyrannical government you can have, because you have the whims of the majority. I don't know if you've ever watched that, but polls change on the drop of a hat. So somebody else makes an impressive commercial. There is a great speech. We have today the Twitter oppression where you can be hounded so hard by that kind of stuff. So democracy doesn't really work. What we live in is a Republican democracy where we have a buffer between the people and the laws that are created. We are a nation of laws, not a nation of majority rules. We have rules instead that protect the rights of the minority. Everyone is equal under the law. Our leaders are to be servant leaders. And for that reason, our founders had this distribution of power because they recognized the sinful nature of mankind and they didn't want to put that all into one place where it could be abused. But each of them were supposed to be a check on the other. So judicial, executive, and legislative were each given different powers. And we've seen a lot of problems with that now because a lot of times we have this liberal idea that we read the Constitution as a living document and we can make it say what we want. Well, there's not much difference between that and tyranny of the majority. Once you are no longer a nation of laws but a nation of whims. Now, missionaries throughout the world often brought with them liberty, education, printing, volunteerism, all of these things. Were the Catholic and missionaries from Spain and France and Portugal ideal? No. They brought with them, they were actually brought with them by the military who would conquer, and then they would use the missionaries were there. But they brought a lot of good too. A lot of the things that are enjoyed in many parts of the world are because missionaries are there. And missionaries today continue to do that. They bring clean water to Africa, mosquito nets, malarial prevention. They establish churches and seminaries so that the people can have their own. And Christianity spreads these ideals. We have what we have in this country because of the Christian flavor of our founding fathers. Whereas in Islam, it's both a religion and a government. It's completely incompatible with a republican democracy because in Islam, they view our government as being Christian because our nation has a majority Christian nation, and therefore they want to get rid of that government. And Republican democracy is not something they can get on board with. So what about modern Christianity? Why do we have a failure to live up to Jesus' teachings? Well, many who claim to be Christian aren't. And this was one of the things that I found in my ministry was not too surprising. You see, you could have people who said they were Christian on Sunday and on Monday committed the most atrocious acts. Stealing from their neighbor, committing other types of crimes, lying, cheating, etc., etc. And even Jesus even says in Matthew 25, we're going to be surprised at who's in heaven and more importantly, who's not. There was a survey done among about 10 pastors who were in these mega churches, and they were asked them, how many people given Sunday do you suppose you'll actually see in heaven? The high was 25%. So just because you're in church doesn't mean you're a Christian. Churches are filled with unbelievers and believers alike. I was told by one lady in my church in Odessa, she said, I'm not coming back to church next Sunday, Pastor. And I said, well, why? And she says, well, the church is filled with hypocrites. And I said, well, you better not look in a mirror because you're one too. Now, at first she was really steamed at me, but then she paused for a second and realized, yeah, that's true. You see, churches are hospitals for the sin sick. So we do want those who have not yet been converted to be there because the only place they're going to hear law and gospel is in the church. You see, our old Adam, we are by nature sinful and unclean. Paul puts it this way: the things that I do, I don't want to do. The things that I do, I don't want. I do. I don't want to do. So we are terrible. We know what we want. We desire to do good. We're just really terrible at it. Okay. We continue to see sin. I call it our autopilot sin. It happens without us even thinking about it. Okay. This is opposed to the other type of sin that is talked about, where we see in the book of Hebrews, and Paul also writes about in Galatians. You see, Christians should desire to do good. We're just inept. But once you start desiring to do evil as a Christian, you are warring against the Holy Spirit, and if you continue down that path, you might even push him out and lose your faith. That's a different kind of sin. We also have the cross. God's wrath on his Son for me. This is really hard for people to understand. How can, isn't Christianity all about death and blood? As a matter of fact, there was a New Age Christian, and I use that word very carefully, in a meeting in Minneapolis many years ago, and some of the people came out and said, well, I don't get that death and cross and blood and stuff. We don't need that, Nicholas Kristof said, go to the front lines in the battle against malaria, prison rape, human trafficking, or genocide. And some of the bravest people are evangelical Christians who truly live their faith. You see that all the time. You see it in our church. You see it in many of churches. People go about sacrificing themselves in order to help other people. That's what modern Christianity is about. As a matter of fact, if you're a pastor and you want to know how you bring young folks into your church, well, people today, our kids today, are the first generation to go through enforced goodness. Part of their day is taken up by going out and doing good works, and this enforced volunteerism has become inculcated into their ethic. So if they go to your church, they don't want to be in the church, they want to do church. Faith, pistos, is an active verb. I don't have faith in Jesus, I faith Jesus. And so they want to do church. They want to have a faith that actually accomplishes something and lives what it says it does. So is the Bible evil? This is another charge thrown at us. You see, God is not evil because the Bible includes stories about violence or sin. Okay? God does, yes, protect sometimes. The one that I hear most often coming to high school kids and college kids is, well, how can you believe in a God who, when the children of Israel are headed to the promised land, he tells them to kill every living thing, men, women, children, animals, okay? I can't believe in a God who would order such violence. Well, let's understand a little bit about what's going on here. First of all, is anybody innocent? The Bible says no. No one is innocent. We are all sinners. And the punishment for sin is death. So one should never try to say that there is innocence. Even babies are born sinful. How do I know that? Because babies can die, and only sin causes death, and death is always the result of sin. That's why we baptize infants. They are in need of faith. Okay? Now, so what about that? Well, there's another story too that comes into this. After the flood, Shem, Ham, and Japheth were each given different parts of the world that has now been separated into continents to go and establish mankind again. Ham was given a spot up in what is now India, that area up there. When he gets to the land that was promised to Shem, that's why it's called the Promised Land, and he says, this is a really nice place, why do I want to go up there? So he settles down there against God's orders. One of his sons, Canaan, was one of the most evil people in all of the Bible, and he from him comes all sorts of wickedness. We have gods established like Moloch and Baal, child sacrifice, etc., etc. And what God is really saying is, go and reclaim that land and get rid of them, because I've given them thousands of years, hundreds and thousands of years, to repent and confess and turn from their ways. They won't, so I don't want them to infect you. You see, instead, the Bible, God condemns evil and teaches people to live holy lives. When people start saying, I will determine what is good and what is evil, they are committing that very first sin that Lucifer did when he rebelled against God, and then the same lie that he gave to Adam and Eve. You want to be like God, determining for yourself good and evil. You see, God himself is the determiner of good and evil, because good only comes from God. And evil actions in the Bible are condemned and righteous living is promoted, even though God is long-suffering. You hear Jesus said, you know, the prophets allowed divorce, but I say to you, that's not the way to live, right? What God has joined together, let not man put asunder. 1 Corinthians 2:14, the natural person does not accept the things of the Spirit of God, for they are folly to him, and he is not able to understand them because they are spiritually discerned. There's also another passage in the Bible where it warns Christians, why do you expect atheists to behave like Christians? They're not. They're atheists. So when you claim God or the Bible is evil, you are either redefining who God is, or you're redefining the Bible, or both. Because once you understand, I tell people, when they say, I can't believe in a God who, I say, well, I can't believe in that God either. Let me tell you who God really is, and then maybe we can have something to talk about. So what do the actual numbers show? And this is probably some of the most interesting things. Most deaths are due to land, resources, power, social class, identity, or secular ideologies like nationalism, colonialism, communism, fascism, or corporate imperialism. How do I know that? Well, World War I, we lost 15 million people. World War II, 70 million. The Soviet Union, in providing its peaceful communism, killed 62 million. Mao Zedong, in taking over China, killed 35 million. And by the way, those death counts continue to rise. You see, atheism leads to moral abolitionism. Deeds have no consequence. When I taught law, I would tell people about the major philosophies behind law. And this notion of might makes right is at the definition, that's the heart of atheism. If there is no external force to determine for me good and evil, then I determine it myself. And you see that in modern philosophy. I determine for myself what's good and evil for me, right? Well, if that's true, then Hitler was right, because Hitler determined that what he did was good, and might makes right. Well, I get objections then. Well, no, I mean a whole nation. It can't just be an individual. Okay, well, all of Germany. Well, maybe several nations. Well, Germany, Italy, Austria, Japan. Where do you stop? The whole point is that without an external determiner of right and wrong, human life eventually becomes not inherently valued. You will see this, by the way, in the way we see politics done here in the United States, where we have the one party that is becoming increasingly atheist and secular and at odds with Christianity. And what do they do to fight? Well, first of all, they label and they dehumanize. And once you do that, well, then you can do anything you want to that other person. And we see that being played out not just in the world of politics, but we see it played out with our children on Twitter, Facebook, etc., in schools and everywhere else. You see, in conflict, people rally around meaningful identity labels. We talked about this with the Hutu and the Tutsi. There was a label given to them by the Belgians and the people that became meaningful to them, and from that then came all of the kinds of atrocities that we see continuing yet today. Marginalize, dehumanize, and stereotype ideologically the other. So you see this in cults. You see this so for instance, in the cult of Mormonism. When you become a member, your identity is then brought up in that group. And a lot of people are looking for that kind of identity because they don't feel like they have any value. They want to have something meaningful in their life, and that identity label gives them that. But the first thing they do is they make you separate your ties from those of your family and friends who don't support you. And they surround you with a sort of a warm, fuzzy love and care and everything else. They'll get you a job. They'll do everything for you. But what they demand is your soul. You become liable to them, and it's a we-they philosophy. So what else do the numbers show? Well, this is from the Encyclopedia of War, the go-to book for anything having to do with wars. They have chronicled 1,763 wars in human history. Of those, and this is, by the way, these are secular human historians. 123 are religious in nature. That's less than 7% of all wars. So if religion causes wars, we're pretty insignificant. It's only 7%. Now here's another interesting. If you subtract Islamic wars, okay, then that percentage drops to 3.23%. So less than 3.5% of all religions are classified by human historians as being caused by religion. There's always non-religious motivations and naturalistic philosophies that are mostly the cause for wars. R.J. Rummel's Lethal Politics and Death by Government says that 170 to 360 million people have been killed by governments, not by religion. If you want to be afraid, don't be afraid of Christianity. Be very afraid of your government. Our government in the United States was built around that. The government was subservient to the people. The people were at the top. That's why we have the First Amendment. And by the way, what is the first right covered by the First Amendment? Freedom of religion. And then comes freedom of speech. And then the Second Amendment, freedom to defend yourself from a repressive government. So James puts it this way. What causes quarrels? Your passions are at war with you. We will always have conflict and wars as long as we have our sinful nature. But we also have Christ. We have the love that he has given us, so we know what love looks like, and we can now love our neighbor. Christ served us, so we know what service looks like, so we can now serve our neighbor. All of these things are given to us by a loving God. So we'll close with a little prayer. I pray, Heavenly Father, that you would help us to have an answer, a ready answer, when people condemn Christianity or religion as being the cause of violence in this world, and instead help them to understand that it's really part of our sinful nature, and we need to curb that. And and we need to learn to love our neighbor instead of despise him. All these things we ask in the sure and certain hope that your Holy Spirit is with us and that you grant what we ask. In Jesus' name, amen.